Well, welcome back, everyone, to Speeding Through History. I'm your host, Jim Zufall, once again joined by Don Gamble as we continue to explore racing history in Western Pennsylvania. Don had a little experience yesterday. Full disclosure, we're taping this on Sunday evening about 8 o'clock, and yesterday I had the opportunity to go to Pennsylvania Motor Speedway for their opener, their Pot of Gold 2. They started this last year, sort of themed all around St. Patrick's Day. Sprint cars from the Fast Series, unsanctioned late model, super late model races, and another series I've yet to see until yesterday. It's a Crown Victoria series. Really, the last remaining rear-wheel drive cars out there are, retired police cars, basically, is what these are. And somebody started a series down south. So I went yesterday. They struggled. Weather really beat them up. It was a beautiful week. They got so much more work done on the track. If you haven't seen Pittsburgh, and the new walls and everything else, you have to get there. Little difficulty with the weather yesterday. They did have a pretty hard rainstorm around noon, which totally wrecked the track. They ran the track in, maybe got started a little bit like 90 minutes later, so according to Tyler. But they did get the entire show in. It never rained a bit, maybe a drop or two is all I ever felt. And really good racing. The late models did great. Of course, a crash exactly right after the green flag happened, and or after the green flag flew, and three of the contenders, the guys you would think would be up front winning in the first heat race for the super late models, Mike Norris. I still want to say Lynn Geisler, Alex Faree, and Colton Flinner, who looks like he hooked into the soft clay and started to bicycle and then caught the rest of them. And they tested the new wall right there between turn one and two. And rest of the night was fine. The feature went I think without a caution. The sprint car 20 lap sprint car race in the Fast Series 20. Sprinters from all over the place came yesterday, and AJ Flick was the winner there. You'll have to pardon me, I do not know the winner of the Crown Victoria race, but they started seven cars, and it was a race of attrition because there was, let's call it, one and a half cars running at the very end. The guy who finished second and effectively last, still running last at least, was pretty much smoking and blew his engine coming across the finish line. So, interesting little series. I think they'll do better down south than they may here, but you never know. Really good night. Again, the what's happened to Pittsburgh in the last couple of years since Blair Kress and his team took over has been remarkable. They're clearing more land. They're improving the roadways. They're improving a lot of things. And for taking the gamble that it is on March 15th, I mean that's really early to start a season. Let's be
Right.
honest. 65 degrees, cloudy with a little bit of rain. We could have been plowing snow instead.
I'm glad you were down there because the improvements to the facility are incredible. The roads coming into the track from the pits and from the main highway, and then the guardrail. It's just like there's never an ending to all the improvements that they're making down
Yeah, they did make an improvement to the incoming driveway, and that proved to be a problem as it turned out. Looks like they put a lot of 4B limestone down, and it started to get churned up as people were spinning out. I mean, I have a Honda CRV, and I bottomed out three times coming up that hill, so
there. Oh,
they need to do a little bit of work there. But again, taking on a facility that isn't the easiest thing to work on, but they're really making a difference. On to what the people I talked to. I had a grand time talking to Darren Gamble yesterday. Probably most of the afternoon and evening I spent with him. I got to talk to Greg Wheeling. I got to meet the brand new race director. Excuse me, I don't know his last name. His first name's Joshua. He's a guy out of Kentucky. He's done some work at Fremont. He's been a flagman over the years, and he was really nervous because this is the first he had been a race director, and from everything I saw, he's going to do just fine. So good to see a lot of the team that was there. I got to talk to Smokey Shemp. We chatted a little bit about the episode that you and I did on Smokey, and he hasn't heard it yet. But I told his grandson Dylan, get your grandfather in front of a computer and tell him to watch it and remind him. And in fact, I reminded him myself that we could have told a lot more stories. We'd have just had to use the edit button a whole lot. So he laughed and understood everything, and
yeah.
reaffirm some of the stories about the flagship and him having a key to the flagship and everything else. So pretty fun afternoon and evening yesterday at Pittsburgh. I'm glad I took the time to go.
Well, here's a note. I sent the entire thing to Smokey's daughter, Sherry. So they already have it, but they're just going to have to figure out time to listen to it.
Well, yeah, they
But
got to plant him in front of a chair and let him watch it or listen to it, and they'll enjoy it. So the initial plan for today, and I think we're going to tell people now, this is the last in a series where we're going to have you, Don, as a guest, at least for now. We can bring you back in future dates, but it's time to let some other people share their thoughts. And I did have a chance to talk to a couple of those people yesterday. Greg Wheeling, for one, who's very excited about doing it. I also talked to some folks. I talked to AJ. I didn't talk to AJ Flick. I talked to Mark and Doug, and Mark was like, "Well, I don't know if I have anything to say." I said, "You could talk about a lot of things, but you know what? We're talking history. You have a serious history. AJ's current." But Mark has a history, and then you can talk about your father too. I mean, Pee Wee Flick was a force around here for years, and then the thought came to me, even though I haven't talked to them yet, the thought came to me that we want to talk generational history and people that, well, two of them at least are still driving. And that would be Colton, Jeff, and Larry Walters. And when I say two of
correct.
them are still driving, it's the middle generation that isn't driving anymore. Larry turned some laps up at Hummingbird and some places in the restored car the restored Nova they built for him, and of course Colton with his modified at Lernerville every week. So we're coming up with a few more guests. I have to line them up and make sure everybody knows they're welcome. And anybody has a story to tell about the good old days of racing, you're welcome to do it.
Put Deke Scott in that mix
The Deke
when you
is
get a
definitely in
chance.
that mix. Yes.
Yes. Well, can we talk about my hero growing up?
You certainly can. We wanted to talk about some drivers of the past, and I know your hero was a guy I want to hear more about, and that's Buddy O'Connor.
Buddy O'Connor, during the early years of racing, I mean, he started in 1938, and I guess that's where he got his number. But if anyone in racing didn't know who he was in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, they weren't really race fans. They just, but he raced at so many places. Like he started out on Route 51, where the old Southland Shopping Center is now. And he had a 32 Plymouth convertible, and it was only a four-cylinder. So the guys racing four cylinders probably don't realize that back in the day, Buddy O was driving one.
So you have mentioned here and elsewhere that you had a grand time when the Pittsburgh Circle Track Club had their senior series, and you got to race against people that were, your heroes early on. And you mentioned a few of them, and I forget exactly. I mean, I don't know whether Herb Scott was one of them or not, but you mentioned a few of them. Did you ever get to turn a lap with Buddy O'Connor?
I never did. Uh, I was probably too young at the time, but we had a senior series race at Motordrome, and Bob Stanford was there with his car, the number 98. And that car had an engine in it where the pistons were the size of water buckets. And he was fast. He won the race, but I really enjoyed it because I finished second in front of Pee Wee Flick, Blackie Watt, and Jim Bickerstaff. Now, that was like I was racing with the Hall of Fame. I was in a car that Bud Kunkel lent me, and it was a good car. I mean, I drove for Bud on multiple occasions, and when he was out of town or just didn't feel like going, he'd have Jim, his crew chief, they'd take the car and call Dawn.
So you mentioned a few drivers there. Let's start with Bud Kunkel. Let's talk about him and what his history is around here.
Well, Bud was amazing. He first started Bud Kunkel Auto Parts, and it was pretty basic when he started, but it became very successful. And then he opened up a second store, and that was also successful. But then his health became a problem, and we lost him way too soon. But when he was healthy, he won a lot of races.
There's been a fair amount of development in Allison Park along Route 8 where Bud Kunkel Auto Parts was, and that's about 5 minutes from my house. But where Bud Kunkel Auto Parts was, remains a vacant lot. Nobody ever built anything there. I don't know whether the family still owns the property. I don't know what the circumstance is, but with all the growing up that Route 8 has had down through the years, that property still sits vacant.
I don't know what the story is there, but it would be a prime piece of property.
Tell me about the Linders. A couple of brothers, right?
Yes. Dick and Gus Linder, they were from the South Hills over around the Dormont area, and they very good in their respective venues. Dick, he drove well, Gus drove the coupes and the sprint cars, and then Dick drove the coupes, and then he went into sprint cars and champ cars. And for people who don't know what a champ car is, that's sort of like a sprint car, but it's more like a USAC, and they traveled all over the country. And he was at Trenton one year, and on his way to Indy. I mean, he had his license, he was good to go. And one night at South Park, I was there, and Gus was racing a modified, and came over the PA system that Dick had been killed.
Yeah.
And so there was a discussion back and forth if Gus was still going to race. Well, he said he was, and then he wasn't, and then they were going to put Herb Scott in the car, and then at the last minute, Gus decided to do it, and obviously it wasn't very successful. But Dick Linder was probably, at the time, the best we had. I mean, when he was driving for the Pallone brothers, they raced 150 times, and he won 52 times in that 150.
Pretty good batting average, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, one night at South Park, there was a fellow named Burl Miller, nice fellow, but he never won anything. He'd start on a pole and he'd finish last. Witzberger said to Burl, if you ever win a feature, I'll give you $1,000. So here comes Burl out on the track, and he takes off, and he didn't go to the back. He's flying. He's passing cars left and right. Witzberger thought, something rotten in Denmark here. So he ran down a victory lane, and it was Dick Linder in the car. So Burl didn't get the $1,000.
That's funny. So again, you mentioned a few other names. I'm going to add a few more. Now, you mentioned champ cars. I saw a picture today of an open wheel car racing, I don't know, somewhere that Don Martin was involved in, and the driver was Dick Swartzlander. Do I have that right?
Yes, you do. Dick bought that car. That was a former Indy car. And Martin was the sponsor on it. And Dick ran it as a sprint car all over the East Coast and had a lot of luck with it. But eventually it was sold, and then whoever bought it took it and restored it back to being an Indy car. But I don't have all the details on that.
As an aside, I look at the picture of that car, and we've all seen pictures of, cars down through history, even the cars that had open or closed cockpits, not like those things. When you look at the safety features now, I mean, from NASCAR on down to the local track, these drivers are literally cocooned in their driver's seat with so much safety equipment. These open top, no roll bar on top of them, open. I mean, these were men among men, were they not?
Yes. Yes, they were. It took a special breed. And all they had was a little roll bar that was like a horseshoe about the size of them sitting in the car, and it would just be high enough to protect their head if they rolled it over.
Don, I want you to throw in any other driver that comes to mind. I'll throw a couple of names out. Drivers that are still with us but retired now. Blackie Watt,
Yes.
real successful. Blackie, wasn't
Yes, he a lot of success in the modifieds and in the late models. And a friend of mine, still, he's in touch with them. He actually cleans their house, and so he'll keep them up to date on what's going on in racing. And if Blackie would dye his hair and you saw him in a fire suit, you would think it was 1970.
Yeah, Blackie's one of the names I remember watching back in, when I was a younger. One of the guys who just recently retired he of course is your son-in-law's father, and that's Lynn Geisler. Recently, I'd say recently retired. He shut her down about 10, 12 years ago, I guess.
Yeah.
since he turned a wheel and now has Alex Ferree behind the wheel for that number one Cochrane car. But my goodness, Lynn was an absolute force to be reckoned with around here, wasn't he?
He had hundreds of wins everywhere he went. You know, when he would pull in, people would say, I wonder who's going to be second tonight. And what was interesting when he decided he was going to hang up the helmet, uh, because we're family and his son's married to my daughter. I mean, I see him a lot, especially for family functions. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do. My phone's ringing off the hook. I don't know who to put in the car because he has such a good sponsorship with Cochrane. You don't want to just shut that down. So I said, well, why don't you call Alex Ferree? He said, why? I said, well, he lives about a half an hour from you. He has his own toter home. He has his own trailer. He has his own race shop. He has his own pit crew. You could be part of the team as an advisor or a consultant. And I think that would work perfect. And they finally got together and they started winning some races.
Well, you mentioned Alex Ferree. How about Ed Ferree? He, late model driver, but he also put his toes in a couple different kinds of racing. He did some NASCAR for a bit, didn't he?
Yes, he did some Busch Grand National racing. And there was a time when he actually had a house down in North Carolina that he shared uh, with Ferree. Ferree shared it with the fellow that owned the property, who is a friend of the Geisler family. But then he sold his interest in that place.
Another gentleman who real recently hung up the helmet for good, I believe. We think he hung up the helmet. We know how race car drivers are. Brian Swartzlander. My goodness, the number of wins he has, the gentleman that he is. I mean, what a great driver.
Well, he told me one time, he said, when I get 100 wins, I'm going to retire. And he did. He got 100 wins and he retired. But what was unique about him, he worked in a steel mill and he didn't get out of work till like 3:30 or 4 o'clock. So the crew would take the car to the track, get it all ready, warm up the engine. And when Brian would get there, it was almost time for fast laps. You talk about a crew that really had it together. The car was ready to go as soon as he got there. But it was kind of touch and go getting there because if he'd have run into traffic, who knows? He would have missed hot laps.
You mentioned the name Jim Bickerstaff. Tell us about him.
Well, Jim kind of owned Heidelberg when it was asphalt. I mean, he won all kinds of races for all different kinds of car owners. But what I found was funny, all the races that Jim won, I went to his house one time just for like a family visit or something. And he was like Mihalik. He only had a half a dozen trophies there. I mean, if he'd have kept all the trophies or put them all on display, he would have had to have added another room to his house just for trophies. But real quiet, real laid back. And there was a time when Gateway Technical Institute was sponsoring my car. And one of the deals with Gateway is I would present Jim with a jacket when he'd win the feature. And this went on for years. And one night at Pittsburgh, I was running in the senior series. And I said, I had a lot of pictures of you with checker flag in Victory Lane. If I happen to win this, can I get a picture taken with you? He said, sure. Well, I forgot all about it and I won the feature. And I hear someone saying, hey, don't forget the picture. And he came over, one of my favorite pictures, standing in Victory Lane with Jim Bickerstaff and the checker flag.
Nice. So recently, and recently being the Daytona this year, a guy we all know at least a little bit, Norm Benning Jr., was able to compete again, I think, in the Truck Series at Daytona this year. Norm Benning Sr., he raced, and was he a successful racer? What was his deal?
Yes, he was very successful. And it's funny, one of his car owners, and the name escapes me right now, but it'll come to me. He said, whenever Norm would take the car out, at the end of the night, it would look like a bulldog was chewing on the front fenders. They had to do a lot of body work on it, but he was good. Now they had a situation at Heidelberg one time where I guess Mihalik was mad at him, and there was an exchange of words, and I think Mihalik, I think he hit him with his helmet and broke his arm.
Oh my goodness.
I'm a little fuzzy on that. You would have to maybe ask some of the other guests that you have on there, but it actually almost shut Heidelberg down. But they weathered the storm and they got past it. But Stormin' Norman, I mean, when he had a good car, look out, he was coming.
So you brought something up, and we're going to step aside from drivers for a minute. I want to hear, you talk about the confrontation like you just mentioned. There have been rivalries down through the years in every form of racing all over the country, but Western Pennsylvania, I expect, had some of the more intense rivalries just because of the number of drivers, talented drivers we have here. So let's go, just like when we were talking to Smokey, talking about Smokey, let's try to tell a couple of stories we can actually air from some of the rivalries and let's be honest, fights that happened down through the years that you can recall.
Well, on the asphalt, you caught me off guard on that because I didn't do my research on that. But former NASCAR champions there, that's terrible. I'm going to have to bail out on that.
That's
one,
okay, not a problem.
There was some serious rivalries there. Just went blank.
That's okay. That's okay. Now, we're going to talk about Herb Scott in a minute, but Herb Scott was, he was a gentleman, but he had kind of a fierce side too, didn't he?
Yes, and when you talk about rivalries, Herb Scott and Joe Mihalik, arch rivals, all the time. And Pat Scott, that was Herb's wife, she said, "We just let the boys be boys. They can play." And then the wives, they never had any problems. They stayed together. They had an association where the wives would do things for the organization. And it was unbelievable. Now, Herb had a bad wreck at Monduke. It was one of Doc Frawley's cars, his 37 or 38 Ford Coupe. And it was wrecked pretty bad. And when they were trying to fix it, Frawley hired Joe Mihalik to fix it. So the rivalries on the track were pretty intense, but off the track, who knows? I thought I found that out by accident that's how the car was repaired.
Joe Mihalik, car owner, or was he a driver at some point too?
No, he was a driver.
But he was known as a car owner too. I recall that Mihalik always had really sharp looking cars, right?
Well, he had a car he raced in NASCAR, and then when he was racing locally, he had a lot of teams that he drove for. But from time to time, he started out with his own cars. He lived on a farm that wasn't very far from, I think it was Clare Ridge Speedway, and he would actually drive the car from the farm to the track and race it, and then drive it home. And then there was a time when he was going to Monduke and he was hauling it in a dump truck, and he had to find a place that was like a amount of dirt that was high enough that he could back the truck up and put the tailgate down and get the car off. And I said to him, "How did you get it back on?" He said, "Well, I put someone in a truck, told him, hold your foot on the brake," and he would go up there so fast until he hit the front of the bed of the truck, and then his friend would let it down.
Oh my goodness.
So they've come a long way on how they haul the race cars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's pretty insane. I recall haulers, you've seen them at Lernerville when I was a kid. How many guys use modified school buses?
Right. Right. And one of the families you need to get on here is Pee Wee Flick. He always had a school bus. Herb Scott had a school bus. And when I bought my first school bus, it needed a lot of work. The brakes were kind of hurting. So I drove it down to Pee Wee's garage and he and Mark fixed the brakes on it. And I used it for a couple of years. It was nice. You could pull a car in the back, and you had enough seats to sit six, eight people. So it was economical because you could buy an old school bus for about $500. And Frankie Cora had one, but he actually went a step further. He cut the bus body in half and just moved the back of the body up so it would look like a big fancy truck. And he used that for years.
Boy, the difference between, a modified school bus and these toter homes and what we're driving now. I recall being at Pittsburgh, oh goodness, it's got to be a dozen years ago, and Tom Lang and I were hanging around together, and he said, I tell people in the drag racing world the same thing. And that's when Pittsburgh still had super late models, and a lot of those guys had the big toter homes like you still see now. And he said, I ask people all the time, you see that great big motor home with a great big stacker trailer behind it? I said, yes, sir. He says, you know how many races that truck has won? And I said, no, sir. And he said, absolutely none.
Yeah.
These, but these toter homes cost more than the house I live in. My goodness.
Yeah, fancy toter home. 500,000 would be chump change.
Talk about coming a long way. Two of the names I don't want to let us go without talking about, and two in my opinion, and a lot of others as well, the two legends. Let's start with Herb Scott.
Okay. I was a big fan of O'Connor and not a big fan of Herb Scott. But one night at South Park, he had won, and I was walking down through the gate with him. And I said, Mr. Scott, I have a question. Does it bother you when half the fans are booing you? He said, when I go to the bank on Monday morning, it doesn't bother me at all. Well, then I got to liking him a little better, and actually became very good friends with him, and and Deke can elaborate on this, had a little input in getting him into the Dirt Late Model Hall of Fame, which was nice. And then when we decided to race the four-cylinder cars, he actually gave me a Vega, and we built it into a race car. But he told Deke, he said, when I'm gone, he said, I want you to give all my trophies to Don Gamble, because Pat was going to throw them out. Well, I think what we did was we sold some of them and then put the money in the kitty, or the whatever you want to call it, for the Circle Track Club, and then it was used for expenses with the club.
The other legend I don't want to get away without talking about, and that's, of course, Lou Blaney.
Well, everybody knows the name Blaney now. I mean, but Lou, what a great guy, a gentleman, soft-spoken. One night up at Raceway 7, he was in the modified, and he came down the front straightaway and never turned, just kept going straight. And I said to him, what happened? He says, I wasn't paying attention. Then that same night, okay, Mike Dutko was racing a micro sprint there, and he's working on it, and apparently he needed some wrenches. So this guy's standing behind him, and he knew what he needed, and he was handing him wrenches. When he turned around, it was Lou Blaney.
Oh my!
Just one of the best in the business. And hey, his two sons, Dave, very successful, Dale, very successful, but words can't describe how successful Ryan is. And like in the recent Cup race, fastest car on the track, started last twice, got all the way up to fifth, and some bozo took him out. It's like they got to get their luck changed around.
Yeah, but we talked about generational racers, you and I, in the past. The Flinner family, the Walters family. You mentioned Pee Wee Flick and his, the legacy he leaves, especially now. I mean, Mark was a champion himself, but my goodness, look at AJ, just all the time winning races. But boy, what the legacy Lou Blaney has left. My goodness. We're going to wrap this up, Don, and again, we're going to let somebody else, going to let a few more guests in here. I'm going to call out some names here in a minute. Actually, I'll do it now because I know you want to wrap up with a couple of things before we let you go. You mentioned Deke Scott. I've spoken to Deke. I've talked to Greg Wheeling last night. I know Ed Miller is aware that he's on my target list of people to talk to. Dave Kohler, and as I said to you earlier, I want to get with the Flick family. I want to get the Walters family, and a bunch of others. Listen, anybody that wants to be a part of this, you think you want to tell us about it, most everybody knows where to find me. I'm on Facebook, Jim Zufall. Look for the videos. You can reach out to me. Anybody at Pittsburgh knows where to get a hold of me if you can't. And certainly Don Gamble knows how to get a hold of me. So if you want to be a part of this and continue what we're doing, please do. Don, I want you to do a couple things. First off, plug Rapping on Racing for us.
One last thing before that. There was a guy named Bob Blaney that was racing dirt and asphalt back years ago, and he was driving a red number 10. So I got in touch with Ed Miller. I said, "Is this any relation to Lou?" He said, "No." But they were both from Ohio, and they both lived pretty close in the same area. So I saw this car, and I said, "Well, what's the story with this car?" Well, the guy sold it to Wally Brockett, and it later became the Union 76 car. Lou Gentile drove it, Brian Muleman drove it, and it Dave Hoffman drove it, but it wasn't Lou's brother. Okay. We still do Rapping on Racing. It used to be every Monday night, but now it's whenever we need to, which gives the reporters a lot more flexibility. And we're going to have a show, talk a little bit about the opener at Pittsburgh, and then between Dave Oliveri and Howie Bayless, they have a lot of nice interviews. So I guess the question is, if somebody wants their driver to be on Rapping on Racing, it's real easy. It's rappingonracing@gmail.com. But I especially want to thank you for opening up this project. We'll say opening up this can of worms to get a lot of people involved in it to preserve history, because when we're gone, it's gone. So if it's recorded and it's saved years from now, whoever wants to get on there and hear about Herb Scott or Deke Scott, or, I mean, even some of the, we'll say younger drivers like Stevie Baker, Tommy Kalala. There's just a whole list of legendary Hall of Fame drivers that need to be addressed and talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many people like you that know that history way better than I do. So, as the host of this thing, I'm playing the part of the guy that wants to hear stories from people like you. And thank you for being, the walking encyclopedia you are. This got the attention, thanks to you, of Lenny Baticki on PRN's At the Track, and I had the pleasure. It's always a pleasure talking to Lenny. It's always a joy talking to Lenny. I had the pleasure of being a guest on his PRN's At the Track radio show the other day, and he said, "How did this all start?" And I said, "Well, let me tell everybody now and tell everybody again." I've had more than a couple of people said, you know Gamble pretty well. You ought to sit him down, let him talk to you, and you should write a book. Well, I have neither the time or the talent to write a book. But as I told Lenny, I can do a podcast. The internet is written in ink. This ain't going anywhere. People can look this up later. My son is encouraging me to turn this into a regular podcast where people can pick it up on Spotify and other places. We'll see where that goes. But yeah, this first 7, now 8 weeks of you and I spending this time together, again, the response I got last night, people stopping me last night that I don't even know, saying, "Hey, thank you. This has been a blast." Doug and Mark Flick both cornered me last night when I went down to ask Mark about maybe doing it. And Doug came over to me, and I don't think I've talked to Doug more than once or twice in my life. And he said, "Jim, this is great. Keep it up." So we're going to keep it up. And again, you think you know somebody who might be interested, you guys that I named out there that are interested and might know somebody else that wants to do this. I'd like to keep this going as long as I feel like I can. And, let's keep it up, Don.
I want to thank you for taking the time and the effort to put this together, because I know how much time is involved just because of what we do with Rapping on Racing. It's very time consuming. So when someone comes up and thanks you, it's well deserved.
Well, I said to Lenny, I said, we're talking about, he asked me about Don Gamble and, being my guest on this show, the first guest on this show. And I said, "Lenny, listen up. Rapping on Racing is in its 5th decade. Is that any good?" He said, "Yeah, that's good."
Well, Actually, your interview with Lenny is going to be on the next show, too.
Perfect. Don Gamble has been our first guest. Thank you so much. 8 episodes we put in. We talked about a lot. I'll bet we picked about, I don't know, 5 or 10% of what's in your head, but we talked a lot about a lot of things, and it's time to hear from a few other people. Don, we're going to have you back again someday, certainly as long as we keep this going. I appreciate what you've done for me over the years. There's no way to thank you enough for what you've done, and now getting this thing kicked off with me has been wonderful. So, sir, I appreciate it. And folks, you've been watching once again, Speeding Through History. Join us again next week. I'm Jim Zufall, your host. Have a good day.
Thank you.